Hi, I'm Captain Pat May, Chairman of the Negotiating Committee. This is the second part of a two-series video on Section 4, Minimum Guarantees and Other Pay Provisions, and Section 25, Scheduling. Joining me today, again, is Rich Brown, Negotiating Committee, and Ted Donnett, Scheduling Committee. Guys, welcome.
Hi, Pat.
Thanks, Pat.
As we discussed before, these two sections are interrelated. Interrelated because Section 4 is how you get paid or when you get paid. Section 25 is the rule set. During negotiations, our pilots were out operating at the highest level of the pandemic. Those issues aggravated a lot of areas within the contract that needed some addressing. The openers dealt with one of these items, which is the disruptions. Pilots wanted to get credit for basically operating a trip that on the front end was totally different compared to what it looked like on the back end. It really is an abrogation of seniority when a pilot runs through that and they end up with the same pay. So there was an effort to address that, but we addressed it in its limited fashion in which the focused negotiation allowed us to do. This is not an entire rewrite of Section 25. It's not an entire rewrite of Section 4. We really tried to maintain the effort and emphasis that the pilots wanted, which is a focus on the highest priority issues with limited issues as well. So starting off with that, Ted, we were able to both create new disruptions and add pay for some disruptions. You want to talk us through some of those?
As you mentioned, during our openers, we highlighted that we wanted to create some new disruptions. The new disruption events are the deletion of the deadhead at the front end of a trip and when a pairing changes from mostly day to mostly critical operations. The day to critical disruption will trigger if you have a day trip and are revised into having more than half of the duty periods touch the critical periods. A day trip is defined as a trip with more than half of the originally scheduled revenue periods begin in the day period and do not touch the critical period. The disruption event will trigger if, as operated, more than half of the revenue duty periods in the trip touch the critical duty period. Also, there are improvements to the existing landing and layover disruption compensation. Now for every extra landing, including the first, this disruption will pay an hour and a half. Previously, the first extra landing paid 30 minutes. And layover change disruptions will now fall into one of two categories. Previously, the layover disruption had to have more than 50% of the layovers changed to trigger. Now 50% or more layover changes triggers a disruption which pays twice as much as previously. Currently, tomorrow will be at 3 credit hours. This change may seem small, but it quadruples the number of times that disruption applies. Second off, a new layover change disruption level of 75% or more layovers change will require payment of 4 credit hour. This disruption will not hit very often, but it is an acknowledgement of the additional effect that a wholesale change to a pilot's trip does not honor the seniority they used to bid. Taken together, these two improvements triple the company's disruption payments for layover changes.
So we're going to move on to the advanced volunteer assignment. Before we get into the details of the change, I think it's important to also discuss what the company wanted to do here. And again, during the middle of negotiations, the company was as understaffed as they ever have been before. They're hiring as many pilots as they could. So they approached this negotiation with trying to address a temporary problem that was created by their staffing formula and putting permanent changes into the contract. We defended against that. We were not interested in making permanent changes based off of temporary problems. The other issue as it relates to staffing had to do with getting pilots to fly more. We discussed it on the last video. We talked about pilots having the ability to build back up. They wanted to force pilots to build back up, and they also wanted to increase max time away from base, things like this that would have reduced or had a follow-on of reducing pilots' min days off. We didn't engage in any of those issues. We defended against all of them, up to and including what the company's initial proposal was on AVA, volunteer, and draft. Rich, you want to talk about some of the changes that we did negotiate on AVA?
Like you said, the company was very interested in and it was aggressively pursuing some of these mandatory changes to pilot schedules that would force pilots to do things. We weren't interested in those wholesale changes to our quality of life as far as being able to control our schedule. But we were able to find a way to address this issue on AVA alone by separating it out from draft and volunteer. We looked at AVA as something that's voluntary, oftentimes not available to pilots, so it affects a very small number of pilots on a very small number of times. And we were also able to negotiate an additional or a higher premium for those AVA hours if pilots are able to meet a couple of criteria, a higher premium of 175%. So we felt like for this small portion of what the company wanted, we were able to capture some value for pilots, and that's why we addressed this issue to begin with. Going back to how it's going to work, there's two criteria basically that the pilots will have to meet in order to get that 175% premium. The first one is at the beginning of the bid month, after the view ad window is closed, or when the secondary line process is completed and the secondary lines are published. A pilot has to have at least minimum bid period guarantee as credit hours for that month. So his credit hours for the month have to at least equal min bid period guarantee.
And so hold that thought for a second. So for pilots looking at this, they may not be familiar with MBPG or min bid period guarantee for a 4-week and a 5-week bid month.
So that would be 68 hours in a 4-week bid month and 85 hours in a 5-week bid month. Once a pilot has met that first criteria, then the second criteria has to do with what actually happened in the month. So there's a second snapshot, so to speak, that's taken at the end of the month, and it takes into account all non-AVA credit hours. Earned credit hours is actually the term that's used in the contract. And what does earned credit hours mean? So the list in the contract about earned credit hours actually lists the things that are not earned credit hours, because that list is a lot shorter than what is considered earned credit hours. And that list includes LMS, grid penalty events, CBA disruptions and disruption-like payments, LOA/MOU disruption-like payments, show pay, RP changes, soft R days, and the vacation cancellation penalty. One easy way to think about what is an earned credit hour is items that will be on your calendar at the end of the month. So based on these two criteria, there are basically 4 possibilities that can happen to you during the month. We've created a flow chart, which will be available on FDXTA.com, and you can go and look it up there yourself, but I'll walk you through it. So we start out with the BLG or RLG greater than or equal to min bid period guarantee after the view ad window closes, or the finalized secondary line. If we answer that question as yes, the next question is, when the bid period ends, all earned credit hours that were not AVA credit hours were, and if you go to greater than or equal to min bid period guarantee, all AVA credit hours will be paid at 175%. If instead you answer the question less than min bid period guarantee, then the portion of AVA credit hours above min bid period guarantee will be paid at 150%. The rest will be paid at 100%. The next two situations are if we answer that first question, BLG, RLG greater than or equal to min bid period guarantee after the view ad window closes as no. Then we go to the end of the bid period, and when the bid period ends, all earned credit hours that were not AVA were greater than or equal to min bid period guarantee, then all of your AVA credit hours will be paid at 150%. If your earned credit hours were less than min bid period guarantee, the portion of AVA credit hours above min bid period guarantee will be paid at 150%, and the rest will be paid at 100%. And just as a reminder, those min bid period guarantees for a 4-week bid month is 68 credit hours, and a 5-week bid month is 85 credit hours. So Pat, those are basically the 4 possibilities for those 2 criteria as you look at what you would get paid for AVA. And when we were in negotiations for this, we looked at that and said there's a significant number of pilots that would have been all the way over on the left-hand side of that flow chart and getting 175% for all of their AVA credit hours. So there was a significant benefit for some of our pilots there. And AVA, once again, is a voluntary program, and although it's been often available in the last couple of years in normal times, and as we're seeing now, it's really drying up and it is not available all that much to our pilots. The one other thing that did change for AVA is in the past, you were unable to submit for an AVA trip if it was under the footprint of a trip you had dropped. The company wanted to increase that restriction, and we acquiesced to that request, so that now if you drop or trade a trip, you cannot pick up an AVA under that footprint. I'd just like to add there, though, that draft and volunteer are the same as they ever were. There's no requirement to fly any before you get paid 150% for draft or volunteer.
So just to be clear, for a pilot to get that 175% premium pay, they need to start their month above 68 or 85 hours, depending on the month, and then fly AVA on their days off.
That's correct.
Yeah, and so the original concerns the company brought to us was isolated to, I think, bid pack specific issues, right? And that were pilots that would essentially drop their entire line, and then they would go in while the company was buying back all this vacation voluntarily, and pilots were picking up essentially 150% flying throughout the whole month. That was the issue they highlighted to us, that they felt like in order to maintain their competitiveness with UPS and the status against UPS, that the pilots would have a restriction that they wanted the pilots to fly their 100% flying before they could get into the 150% flying. That was their general philosophy. Obviously, we worked through a lot of the concerns there, and we did protect the volunteer and the draft. So again, a pilot still has the total flexibility. If they want to drop the trip, sit back and wait for a volunteer or a draft trip, they can still do that today. That hasn't changed. The noticeable change here is if a pilot does drop the line of the restrictions on AVA, and then the potential that their AVA, if that's what they're going for, could be paid at 100% now. Again, leaving the pilot as the decision makers in this paradigm, really the pilot can take a look at their schedule and decide what's in their best interest and how they want to work. Do they want to work more hours for more money? Then they're going to do what you say, Ted. They're going to go after the 175% and maybe avail themselves to volunteer or draft. So it kind of makes sense in the long run. It is a paradigm shift. It's certainly one we want to be clear to the pilots that we did move with the company on this issue, but it was a limited move that also has some upside potential too.
I did want to also add that the restrictions at the beginning and the end of the month, the reason that those are separate is that those credit hours that you end up with on your line at the end of the view add window don't necessarily have to be the same credit hours that you end up with at the end of the month. We're not locking you into flying whatever you received in your bid. You can drop, trade, whatever during the month, as long as that last number, the number of earned credit hours at the end of the month, is above min bid period guarantee.
Yeah, and an important takeaway too for a lot of the instructors in the schoolhouse under the Section 11 pilots, maybe working a full month in the schoolhouse, but they've also been asked to sell back vacation, as they often are. So in that situation, then they're offered a trip out on AVA to go fly the line. If they're flying a full flex schedule, they're going to get all those trips at 175%. So again, it maximizes that high-end pay on the AVA for those folks. Another area that came to the surface again throughout the pandemic, but we always knew it was a problem, was the hotel standby usage. How the company used it and where it was misused, in our opinion, manipulated even to backlog or to jam up pilots' trip trading ability. We even saw some extremes during the pandemic that we've never seen before, and that was where the company was rolling in a pilot, revising them with the hotel standby in base to keep them on the hook, essentially. So we had a lot of issues with hotel standby. One of the openers was to eliminate it altogether, and that would have been within Section 25, was to eliminate base hotel standby. Between Section 25 and 12, there's tentacles as well, and that was a real challenging issue for us to work through. Our initial opener was to get rid of it altogether. Company wasn't interested in getting rid of base hotel standbys altogether, but we did find a way through the woods, I think, from some creative thought with the PSIT group, from the MEC members, from our pilots, and some ideas. We know there's interaction with R24, which is the de facto assignment, right, from R24 was these base hotel standbys. So we really don't have an R24. In essence, it gets watered down. So we kind of dealt with this issue in a couple different ways through base hotel standby, some new restrictions, limitations where it can be used, as well as a transition over to a real long call out, which is R16. You guys want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. Pat, R24 and base hotel standbys have been problematic for a very long time. Now, as in our opener, we tried to eliminate them, but that was a very high bar to set. And we think that, like you said, the company wasn't interested in the complete elimination of base hotel standbys. They're actually trying to go the other direction. But we were able to address a lot of the issues that we have with base hotel standbys that we think is going to be satisfactory to the pilots. One of the first issues with it is that base hotel standby, there's no limit as to when you get sent out on a trip. Like you said, it frustrates open time, and then also our R24 is a de facto hotel standby line. So as far as the limits that are placed on the trips given to base hotel standbys, currently you could be on a, say, 2 or 4 day hotel standby trip, and on your last day you could get a 5, 6, 7 day assignment that takes you into your days off, all at straight pay. There was no limit, and this caught many by surprise to when they were given an assignment that had them flying into their days off at straight pay off of these base hotel standbys. The way that we were able to combat that is that we put a limit on it. For domestic trips, it's 36 hours. For international trips, it's 84 hours that assignment must be done by the end of the last period of the base hotel standby. The other issue with base hotel standbys is the company is creating them out of thin air to give to pilots on long haul reserve or what have you. So we were able to limit that tremendously. First off, just like regular trips, all known base hotel standbys need to be published in the bid pack. And then as a PSIT, we can put those onto lines. Base hotel standbys, of course, for the same reserve coverage, pay more, not just because of time away from base, but also because the hotel itself, the per diem, the ground transportation, it is expensive for the company to do that. After the bid packs are published, if the company, just like X pairings, sees the need for more base hotel standbys, they can be created during the secondary process, and of course they are then available for secondary line holders to bid on. But once, unlike extra flying, once secondary lines are finished, the company can no longer create any more base hotel standbys and assign them to a pilot. The greatest effect for this is long call reserve pilots now are no longer subject to base hotel standby assignments specifically created for them. They could get a base hotel standby, but that would had to have been a base hotel standby that was already in either the bid pack or created during the secondary line process. Or in other words, it's something that's been sitting in open time that we've all seen and viewed, and it didn't just pop up 2 minutes ago specifically for you.
Part of the reason that the company has maintained that they need to bring in those R24s for a base hotel standby is just a utilization factor so that they have coverage for that next morning's launch. The way that we got around this problem is to shorten the call-out period for our long call reserves to R16 rather than R24. What that allows the company to do is still utilize those pilots for that next morning's launch. Now, we recognize that this shorter call-out period won't work for everyone, but R24 didn't work for everyone either. For those pilots that have commuting options, this will allow a reserve period where they can truly sit at home. It does make them more available, but they can sit at home until the company needs to use them. So that R16 piece was what allowed us to actually accomplish separating the long call reserve from that base hotel standby and limiting that base hotel standby to the build process up to the end of the secondary line.
So where did the 16 hours come from? The 16 hours came from the assignment window opens at 10 a.m. local base time, at which point Cruise Resource Scheduling can start handing out trips or assigning trips to long-haul reserve pilots. This means that the earliest show time a long-haul reserve pilot or an R16 pilot could have would be 2 a.m. This should give many pilots the opportunity to commute in for the trip and get some fatigue mitigation.
That fatigue mitigation was important to us in this, and that's one of the reasons, another reason that we did it up at 16 instead of 14, which is the company's first proposal, was to get pilots that opportunity for a couple more hours rest after they come into the hub.
And the base hotel standby being built in the bid pack also essentially guarantees us higher pay for the same footprint of work that,
Exa-
right, that a reserve assignment
And-
pilot would have otherwise achieved. And I think the September Memphis 7-6 bid pack would be a good example of that, right? A 5-day hotel standby paid $24.40. The same reserve footprint would have paid 20 hours. So essentially a 4-hour and 40-minute difference.
Exactly. And that's where the company is going to have a financial limitation on themselves to create too many of these, because why would they pay 4 hours extra for this exact same coverage? And they do have some reasons and situations where they're willing to do that, but we don't expect this to be an across the board normal situation for them to create extra base hotel standbys.
And what goes along with that is ground transportation and a hotel.
In addition to the extra 4 credit hours, yes.
And as Rich mentioned, there may be some commuters that look at this and now might decide, you know what, R16 is a little bit more valuable and better for my schedule versus the old R24, which was a de facto base hotel standby in many instances. You might be able to get away with a day or two at home, but by and large, I think what it's going to do is open up the reserve options for pilots. You know, if you're looking at a standard reserve call out of an hour and a half to 2, depending on the base you're in, you know, that's a pretty small group of pilots located right near the base. This R16 will start to reach out to pilots, and pilots who are living on the outskirts of those boundaries now will take a much more serious look at maybe bidding for R16.
We now have a true long-haul reserve system.
Pat, you mentioned the difference in pay for the base hotel standbys versus the R days, and that was one other thing that we were able to accomplish in this contract. The company has been paying those blocks of hotel standbys, either time away from base or R day value, whichever is higher. But that was not actually codified in the contract. The contract just mandated that they pay R day values. So we were able to codify that and make sure that that difference in pay is maintained going forward, as we've limited the number of hotel standbys that they can put into open time.
Thanks, Rich. And just to be clear, so now if I'm a pilot that has, say, an R16 and I've got a block of 6 days, but through the secondary line process or the bid period process, what shows up is a 5-day block of hotel standby. And that 5-day block actually sits inside of my R16 footprint from beginning to end. The company could still assign me that base hotel standby because it's an open time.
Yes, and it's been sitting and it had been available for someone to pick up. We've all seen it. It wasn't just created for that assignment.
They couldn't make one out of thin air to fit on my footprint, pull it out of thin air. An ad hoc one is what they call them.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Okay.
In addition to that, we've put limits on what they can do as far as breaking up base hotel standbys. They're allowed to break apart a base hotel standby as long as the footprint of the base hotel standby doesn't move. They're not allowed to slide base hotel standby periods together to create a longer base hotel standby periods. So we've really limited what they can do. They're really not able to create a base hotel standby on a day that they did not previously have one under these new rules.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, on base hotel standbys, we were not successful in eliminating them totally. The company obviously had a strong desire to maintain that flexibility to put them into the system, but we seriously limited where they could be placed and the pilot's expectations of what that will require them to do. They can either bid them in the normal bid pack, or they may be able to get them in the secondary lines if they desire them. Other than that, the likelihood of them seeing a base hotel standby would originate if they're sitting on an R16, in addition to all the other normal assignments that they could get as an R16 pilot.
We were able to address a lot of the issues that led us to try to eliminate base hotel standbys completely.
So one of the other opener items was a preferencing option for pilots who are on reserve. Now we have the first fly system. We know how that works, but we wanted some, I guess, more thorough preferencing option there. You guys want to talk us through what's available now to the pilots?
Sure, Pat. So the first fly preference was basically a blunt instrument to get yourself on the road instead of sitting in Memphis or wherever your reserve period is. But it didn't allow for pilots that wanted to fly a certain trip in open time, because you know, when you're sitting on reserve, a lot of guys will look in open time and say, hey, how many trips are in open time? Where am I on leveling? You know, what am I likely to get selected today or not? Well, now, if you look in open time and there's a trip that you'd like to fly, this new preferencing system will allow you, when you put in your first fly preference, to either preference a trip or a kind of trip under like similar to a general makeup request. And then it's broken up into two sections within reserve, just like now, where trips under 60 hours will be awarded based on that first fly preference in seniority order. They will be awarded on that. Trips greater than 60 hours, the company still has some discretion. Your first fly preference will be given a priority, but if there's a better fit from somebody else on reserve, then the company will be allowed to award that trip to that other pilot.
It should be noted that's 60 hours time away from base. So the pilots that are on reserve for multiple days and a trip over, say pilots are on a reserve for 7 days and a 7-day trip becomes open. Two pilots both want the trip. That trip will go to the pilot who is in the best fit for that trip and senior, the one that wanted to preference it.
So in the end of the day, best fit still trumps if it's 60 hours or more. But a pilot now who's sitting reserve has the ability to preference, regardless of best fit or not. I can preference no matter what.
Yeah.
I'm just more guaranteed if I have less than 60 hours.
Yeah, well, 60 hours time away from base or less, it's
Yep.
guaranteed in seniority order. And this way, pilots are able to put themselves on first fly for certain types of trips and not be subject to the type of trips that they weren't interested in flying.
Great. Well, I appreciate it, guys. So you can see here that a lot of work went into our work rules, scheduling, and Section 4 tie-in. At the end of the day, we certainly worked with the company on a few items that they've identified as efficiency concerns for them. What we did and what we have said we have done continually throughout this process is we've kept the pilots in charge of their outcome. They're the decision makers on what happens. We haven't forced or mandated anything with the pilots, so they get to maintain their quality of life, because that's what these sections are all about. It has to do with a pilot's quality of life. I think we've made some decent incremental improvements, especially with regard to pilots' trips being disrupted. You know, and the pilots will see economic improvement or gain from that. We clearly were not able to eliminate that type of disruption altogether from the pilot schedule, but we addressed it, I think, in a meaningful way. So when it's all said and done, I think the pilots will look at Section 4, 12, and 25 combined and see some significant improvements, in addition to, you know, the numerous things that we've done in Section 12 to limit or to increase pilots' rest. We'll talk about that in another video, and we'll get to that. But I think overall, the big, broad quality of life concerns our pilots had, which was highlighted at its peak during the pandemic, we really dealt with those in I think, a pretty sufficient way to deal with this contract moving forward. We kept entire rewrites out of the discussion. Pilots did not want entire rewrites like we did in Section 24 last time around, but they were targeted and very important issues for the pilots. So thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Pat.
Thanks, Pat.
Well, thanks again for taking the time to view the video presentation that we have. We look forward to seeing you again in a future presentation.